You're tuned to WPPM LP Philadelphia 106.5 FM, PhillyCam Community Radio, and PhillyCam TV, also streaming live to Facebook. Thank you for tuning in to Reimagine, a partnership between Reclaim Philadelphia and PhillyCam.
Hey everyone, welcome to Reimagine, a monthly hour-long show hosted by Reclaim Philadelphia and PhillyCam, bringing together leaders to discuss how policy impacts lived experiences of working-class Black and Brown communities and how we hope to imagine better futures together and offer steps for real social transformation. Yeah, I'm excited that we're spending so much time talking about these important seats that don't get as much attention as they deserve. Part of what's made it difficult to get people excited about these races is that most voters either don't know who their committee people are or what they even do. And there's a lot of confusion overall when it comes to the local structure of political parties. So, to help walk us through the basics or Wards 101, we have local community organizer Steve Paul, who ran for committee person in the 17th Ward in the last ward elections. And I swear, I see Steve everywhere, and he has served as political director, steering committee, or board member for several progressive organizations in our city. Thank you, Steve, for joining us on our program today. Oh, you might be muted, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks. And so, yeah, let's dive right in. Like, we talk a lot about wards. We talk about ward leader. What are wards for folks watching the program?
Sure. So basically, I mean, a lot of folks know, like, running elections and could be super complicated. Our democracy is a huge system. So in order to make sure our elections are really coordinated in a coherent way and everything runs smoothly, the city of Philadelphia is divided into 66 sort of geographic areas, and that's what we call wards. And so, I live in Germantown, so I live in a 12th ward. I used to live in a 17th ward. So these 66 wards are basically just the city of Philadelphia being broken down into these smaller units so we can actually run our elections and keep track of everything. And so each of these 66 wards have a certain number of divisions, what we call voting districts. And there are about 1,703 divisions, to be specific, in the city of Philadelphia within those 66 wards. So you have 66 wards, and then each of those wards have a certain number of voting districts or divisions. And so, for example, I live in the 12th ward, division 20, which essentially tells you where you go vote, essentially.
Yeah, and so, yeah, just looking at those divisions, these are really, really small. They're like a few blocks. So this really is I would say the most grassroots level of elected office that we have in the city. So can you tell us a little bit more about what are committee people and what they do?
Yeah, so both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are, like you said, are really organized in such a way where the political power of both parties really start at the neighborhood and a local level. That power starts at the grassroots level of the committee people, right? Those are the people that really have the power in both parties. So each of the divisions that I just mentioned earlier, the 1,700 divisions, theoretically elect 2 committee people every 4 years. And I say theoretically because sometimes nobody runs for these seats, unfortunately. Sometimes they stay vacant for years without being filled, which is really unfortunate. But every 4 years, we elect these neighbors in our division, and they serve 4-year terms. And both the Republican Party, again, and the Democratic Party have 2 committee people for each division. That means there could be 3,000 people in the city of Philadelphia who are elected every 4 years to serve as committee people in all of these divisions in these wards. And we can get into a little bit more too. In addition to just committee people are being elected, then the committee people then themselves, they meet within their wards. So for example, all of the committee people in my 12th ward, after we all elect them, they meet together to then elect a leader amongst themselves, which is called a ward leader.
Yeah, and what are the responsibilities of a committee person typically?
Yeah, so I mean, it's it could be a really powerful tool of like organizing and mobilizing voters in the city. Committee people are supposed to register new voters whenever they move to their divisions, get out the vote for candidates, help candidates get on the ballot by circulating their petitions. But they can even do even more than that, right? Like outside of the political, just getting educating voters about the candidates, getting candidates on the ballot. Outside of elections, they can also let their neighbors know what's going on in their community, what's going on in city council and state house, educate their division about the political issues that are going on in this country and in their neighborhood. And, one of the things I did as a committee person also is like, you can actually, as a committee person, you can mobilize your neighborhood for and against a specific policy, right? If you are sick and tired of seeing your rec center not funded, you can organize your community to do something about that. And these divisions are really sometimes really small, right? I'm talking about maybe 200 doors and 600 registered voters in a typical committee division. So you could really use it as a tool of power to, what Anton was talking about, like hold elected officials accountable, making sure they're actually doing the work in our community, and empowering your neighbor and your neighborhood to actually be involved in the political process.
And Karen and Anton talked a little bit about like what the differences between an open ward and a closed ward. A lot of this comes down to the power that ward leaders have in order to make those open and democratic in the first place. What are the other like ways that ward leaders have a lot of power when it comes to who is represented and who everyday voters end up choosing when they get into the polling place?
Yeah, I will. So one thing I want viewers to be clear on is like, I really, in my opinion, think the committee people have a lot of power because they elect the ward leader, right? Like it really starts with the two committee people that you elect, because not only do they have all these responsibilities as a committee person, but after their election, they get to choose that ward leader. And that ward leader, to your point, is super powerful, right? And I think Anton talked about this a little bit. They're supposed to make sure all of their divisions have enough polling workers and at the poll to make sure that things are like actually running smoothly on election day. That includes like not just the two committee people, but the 5-member election board. They also are, I think Karen mentioned this, they, outside of maybe the 6 to 9 open wards, all of the other wards, the ward leaders actually determine who actually is endorsed by the Democratic Party. So whenever you walk up to the poll and someone hands you a sample ballot and you see these names on there, that was the ward leader's decision on whose name got to be put on that ballot. And that's the super powerful thing when you have thousands of people pushing this specific name for people to vote on. So ward leaders really have a lot of power in terms of like which candidates get elected. They're also supposed to, raise money for the wards to make sure like, things are able to function and the ward has enough money. Candidates all the way from president, governors to city council members, they actually go to ward leaders before they run, right? Like to tell them, hey, I'm running, would love your support. So it's a really powerful position to hold and within both the Democratic and Republican infrastructure.
Yeah, and as you named, a lot of ward leaders end up just supporting who city committee ends up endorsing. Many times we've seen that that's counter to what voters actually want in Philadelphia. And then another thing that I feel like I've seen that's been important from the last election is that we had all of these candidates pop up in the general that weren't in the primary. And that's because the ward leaders essentially got to pick these magic seats and they got to fill these seats. And that's the same thing that happens whenever special elections happen in certain areas. So yeah, there's a lot of power when it comes to these positions. I feel like we have to wrap it up a little bit, but I do want to hear a little bit about what motivated you to run for committee person, and why do you think it's important for more people to be invested in these elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always had this passion and understanding about like, what power is about, right? Like, because this is really about having the power, right? Like the ability to advocate and change your circumstances in your community and bring resources in your community. And so, I grew up in Northwest Philadelphia. I attended all public schools. At a very early young age, I noticed the difference between my school, Martin Luther King High School, which I had to walk 30 minutes to, versus Central, which I lived right there. Central was like 5 minutes from my house. I noticed the fact that I had to go through a metal detector when I had to go to school. By the time I was in 11th grade, I had police pull out guns on me twice. Like, so all of these systems, underfunded public schools, being over policed, all of these things, like, go back to having the right city council person, the right state house member, the right governor, and all of these things were connected to like the electoral process that, when I found out like, oh man, it starts at the committee person level, I get to choose the ward leader who then gets to choose the leader of the Democratic Party. I was like, sign me up. So, I ran in 2014 just because I knew the next city council and the next mayoral election was coming up, and I wanted to have an impact on that. And, I was in a closed ward, the 17th ward at the time, but I organized the town hall. 250 of my neighbors came out and they got to hear from the candidates, and they supported a candidate at the time that my ward leader did not support, who was an education activist, Councilmember Helen Gim. And to me, that's the kind of power a committee person can have. I took my experiences of going to underfunded schools and really wanted to push someone that I thought shared my value and we would fight for public education, despite, at the time, my ward not wanting to support that person. And so, I encourage anyone, if you care about any issues in your community, to get involved at the grassroots level. Even if you don't win as a committee person, the truth is the conversations at the doors that you have with your neighbors, starting to have these kind of conversations, developing those relationships will definitely build relationships with your neighbors that you can still impact the outcome of the elections. Like the last thing I say is like, we saw really low turnout yesterday, right? Like, we have to do the work. Like, we know the way people show up to the polls is by people having conversations at the door, right? And so we need these 3,000 plus seats to be filled with people who are going to be knocking on doors, talking to their neighbors about the issues, not just on an election day, but throughout the year, to get them involved so that when elections do come up, people are, like, they have a stake, they understand their stake for like going out to the polls and electing folks.
Yeah, and I always say, it's like we need to work out this voter muscle, and that's what empowered committee people like you can really do to contribute to this, and why I think more folks from the movement should be joining these races, running for office. So thank you so much, Steve, for helping explain a little bit about the structure, and excited to see you run again in next year's election, hopefully.
My name is Diamante Ortiz. I use she, they pronouns. I am the communications organizer at Reclaim Philadelphia, and I am here today with Kia Stewart. Kia, how are you?
I'm doing well. Good to see you, Diamante.
Yeah, so I'm just going to give a little overview about who you are and how we're going to bring you into this conversation. I'm really, really excited. Making sure folks can hear me okay, because I kind of hear weird feedback. So on Reclaim's side, I wanted to also mention before, through the work of the Shift the Narrative Coalition, as I was mentioned before, from Aubrey and other folks at Resolve and Equally Informed 215, the notion of being able to, carry our stories and being able to, speak truth to power in terms of what is important and what is being stigmatized in our communities has been a really essential and key conversation stemming from the unfortunate Buildings Matter 2 headline, as well as a lot of hypersensationalization that comes within the media, specifically with Black and Brown and working class communities. And so I'm really glad that Kia Stewart can come through today. Kia, I know you work at the Public Defender's Office, and I know you've been a very important and a very central community voice in terms of our community conversations with the Inquirer on behalf of the Shift the Narrative Coalition. And so I'm curious to not only have you discuss who you are and what your background is, and essentially what was your main takeaways from those community conversations?
That was a lot at one time. Um, what's one thing you want me to answer first?
If you can give a background on who you are and how you're involved in the Philadelphia community.
Okay. Um, well, my name is Kia Stewart, and I work at the Public Defender's Office. I've worked there now over 25 years. I've had several roles with them. Now I work in their Federal Community Defender Office as an administrative assistant, and I work in their Capital Habeas Unit. Um, Capital Habeas means that we represent people who are on death row. The reason why I became involved in the Inquirer meetings was because last year the outgoing administration went through with a lot of federal executions. It was very painful to observe and watch, and I wanted to become more involved in the community as far as how stories are told, and that the people who are telling the stories become more aware of how it affects the community, and people who may be involved in these stories and what it does to their lives on the back end that they may not ever be aware of on the front end.
Um, and you mentioned over the last year, we've seen ways people powered movements in our city and nationwide are calling for more accountability when it comes to the carceral legal system, otherwise known as the criminal justice system. But even that can be like a very pejorative term, unfortunately. Well, one question that I have for you is, how has it impacted the way you see newsrooms covering policing and community violence?
Well, I don't know that my perspective has really changed. I feel that historically, the news is skewed. Um, the stories that are told are from a perspective not taking into consideration people as people. If you've committed a crime, you're now less than a person, viewed as less than a human being. And based on the sum of a mistake that you've made, this is all that you're seen for. People who commit crimes are not seen as fathers, community members, mothers, daughters. And it's very harmful to not see people for all of who they are and to only see them for one action that they may have committed.
Absolutely. And why do you think it's important for, everyday working folks like yourself to be involved in these conversations?
To share how it impacts us for people who may have never been involved in the carceral system at all. They may not be aware of how it impacts people's lives. People are impacted and prohibited from voting, prohibited from maintaining good, viable employment. And so lifestyles are changed, and some people are not able to really make the best of their lives because of these hindrances. And also, the community needs to be involved because these are stories that are being told about the community that we live in, and the perspective and the opinions that people have about these neighborhoods are based on the stories that we are told. Usually, the first story that you hear is going to be the one that you're going to base your opinion on or possibly believe the most. And so, those stories need to be told carefully.
Absolutely. Um, and you kind of touched upon this before, but what are harmful narratives newsrooms need to rethink?
So during the meetings with the Inquirer, there were some conversations about I don't remember the name of the type of stories they are, but they're quick little blurbs that will tell you the details that something happened overnight. Someone was shot. We don't know a lot of details. They may or may not have a name. They may or may not share all of the details of what happened. And usually the source of these types of reports are from the police. And those types of stories are not necessarily full encompassing of a true picture of what has happened. It's usually a one-sided type of a story because it's only coming from the police. And if someone's name is in that story, and depending on the information that's shared, if it's true, if it's not true, it can become harmful for people who have to live in the aftermath of this story and other people being aware of it. And something that came about in one of the meetings that I remember that bothered me was where these types of articles originated. And the person in the meeting from the Inquirer shared that that type of storytelling is to fill up pages when things are a little sparse from the newsroom. And I know that from my own education that those types of stories originated from slavery, when people escaped and there were news articles put out about them, or if someone was captured and they were beaten, or different types of stories that were told that are damaging to how we view other people as human beings. And because a lot of these stories are told about Black and Brown people, this systemic way of seeing people as less than human and property, belongings to be discarded, mistreated, is a long held history in this nation, and it's carried through to this day.
Really unpack the issues of white supremacy and settler colonialism when it comes to the ways in which we are not addressing human beings. And there's a lot of stigmatizing that comes from it, a lot of commodifying that comes from it too, because a lot of newspapers, especially with such older established institutions such as the New York Times, such as the Washington Post, unfortunately have had, issues with like putting out runaway slave ads and putting out these very derogatory, mentions of human beings that are not part of this abolitionist perspective or even just a human first perspective that isn't covered as much. And you mentioned being motivated to get involved because of the federal executions. And my question to you is, how can changing media narratives help, destigmatize these often taboo and unacknowledged topics?
Through the meetings, I observed that this change is going to be something that is on the slow side. I don't see it being something that will be broadly transformed very quickly. The feeling I got was that a lot of people have long held opinions and views of the news, of each other, and those are the types of things that will take some time to transform in people. However, I think that enlightening people to the other side of the story, and I'm not saying that it's okay to commit acts of crime. However, understanding why this may have occurred, what were the circumstances around it, can really help us have more compassion to one another, as opposed to being so quick to judge and assume the worst of someone without even knowing anything about them except what you saw on the news.
Yeah. And I think from that, it's also a lot of projection and a lot of fear mongering that comes from it too. And we've seen this within the Trump administration, of course, especially with like how journalists have been targeted, as well as independent media has been targeted in order to disseminate, fear from the truth, essentially, because there is a lot of historical and political analysis that comes into these important conversations. And stemming from the conversations you mentioned before, what has been one thing that has surprised you the most from your conversations with the Inquirer?
What comes to mind is a little bit of reservation and hesitation to accept the changes that were presented during those meetings. There was one special guest that came to a meeting, and off the top of my head, I'm sorry that I'm not remembering where she was from. But she talked about specific words that can be changed as far as describing a person and talking about a person to be more human-centered, so that we're not stigmatizing people. And some of the responses were very not as open to being easily changed as I anticipated that they would be, as the purpose of the meetings was to talk about changes. And so I expected some changes to be, I guess, welcomed more or easier to understand than they were. And I'm hoping that over time, maybe those were just initial responses, and that with some time and thought that maybe, those views were softened a little bit, and, maybe they'll take those considerations to heart and really implement them.
Yeah, definitely. And mentioning before the root causes that you have been dedicating your life to, essentially, and what you've seen firsthand, what are the ways that you want to see those root causes you care about and are a part of displayed on a larger platform? And what do you think is currently lacking?
That's a rough question. Ultimately, revamping of the entire system, because I just believe in a true change of the system would mean that almost everything has to change. The way the system has operated thus far historically does not serve all well. It appears that way on paper, but we all know that the implementation of these policies, laws, rules is not always doled out broadly across the board. And for some, unfortunately, the stick is shorter in one person's hand than it is in another. And so to truly make things even, I think that the whole system would have to crumble in order to really rebuild a new foundation based on true humanity for everyone and equality.
The really big emphasis on media equality and equity, and just you're really dropping the gems, and I want to like take the time to just like whew, it's like that's really real, especially the ways in which you can see sometimes yourself in these articles, or you can see yourself in terms of you know going on the conversation of media representation and going on the conversation on or are my communities being accurately represented, when knowing that there is still joy within our communities that is not being able to be discussed, or there's not a larger platform being discussed. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen a lot of articles that talk about the issues of gun violence, but don't really highlight, there have been amazing potlucks that are happening, or, there are amazing community leaders that deserve that voice and deserve that stage, essentially. And so you bring up a lot of great topics and a lot of underlying processes that go into like making an article and seeing how like the sausage is made, quote unquote. And I think that's something that's also surprised me a lot from these conversations as well. And seeing the ways in which perspectives have often shaped what we see in media today, unfortunately. And the last question that I wanted to bring on is, what do you think will be the impact on Black and Brown folks if the media doesn't change how they discuss these nuanced problems in our communities?
I feel that people will continue to distrust the media. They won't want to speak with reporters. They won't want to share their perspectives. And it will continue to be lopsided the way that it has been, where only certain views are seen and heard. And unfortunately, unless media gets involved with the communities to gain some trust and to really show an interest in helping people through these issues that they're presenting these stories about. If someone is shot, resources are needed, not just gossiping about that someone was harmed, but to really offer some resources to the community, to the people affected, so that they can get the help that they need, instead of only, oh, it's a shame that that happened to so-and-so, and move on to the next story.
Yeah, absolutely. The importance of a human first approach and recognizing that people are people and these are livelihoods that unfortunately haven't been lived out at the threat of gun violence, at the threat of state-sanctioned violence, and the ways in which the carceral system creates a lot of boxes and often compounds a lot of trauma in the ways in which we've seen before. And I definitely want to just open the floor if there was anything else that you wanted to mention that wasn't discussed in terms of your work, or just anything else you want to share.
I was very appreciative to have the opportunity to participate in those meetings, and it's definitely spearheaded me to want to become more involved in the community and to be helpful in sharing my knowledge and background any way that I can. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but moving forward, I'm definitely open to being a resource to really spearhead the change that's necessary. And if I can encourage others to do the same, then I would like to do that too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kia, for joining us. I really appreciate your patience and your willingness to help, because these are really difficult conversations, and I do hold space for that. Thank you so much.
Pennsylvania State Senator Nikhil Saval will be joining us to discuss the state budget that was just voted on and how it is connected to education. Senator Saval represents the 1st District here, which covers most of Center City, South Philadelphia, and parts of North Philadelphia. Senator Saval, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you, Sergio. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and honor.
So before we jump into the larger conversation, I want to know a little bit about yourself and what's at stake for you when it comes to education in Philly schools.
So it's a great question. I mean, my immediate stake is just that I am the parent of 2 children who are going to attend Philly public schools in a few years. One of them is 2.5, so they'll be in school in about 2 years, and then another who's a 3-month-old. But I'm committed to neighborhood schools. I want to support their stake, their health, and the health of the schools around them. But of course, that's just my entryway. I mean, it's just not my 2 children. I think there are families with children all around the city who are facing the same stressors. All our children deserve to learn and grow in buildings that are safe, free from mold and lead and asbestos and other environmental toxins, and totally equipped to support their well-being as we continue to experience the warmer and wetter weather accompanying our climate crisis. And this is related to my neighbors, my friends, my constituents. Everyone on my block sends their kids to neighborhood schools. Many of my friends and closest, friends are teachers, school counselors, school nurses, paraprofessionals, they're cafeteria workers. I mean, so this is, it's just close to me. The schools are just anchors for everything that we do. And, the other thing that I'll just say is, the inequality even within my district among schools is really palpable. My district has the First Senate district has some of the most well-resourced schools that have a lot of, fairly well-off friends of groups. And it also has some of the least resourced. It has schools that have closed, over the last 2 years because of unremediated lead and exposed asbestos, and schools that have the resources to kind of move quickly to change that situation. And so that inequality is also deeply palpable. It changes it changes patterns of real estate. It affects gentrification. It affects where and how people are able to live, including myself and people close to me. So that's everything. I feel like schools are truly connected to everything, and that's where I come at it.
Yeah, I mean, I could tell you that I felt the inequality. I went to high school in Montgomery County, Maryland, and it's one of the richest counties. But I went to a Black and brown majority public high school, and I was my school had vastly different resources and facilities compared to the other schools in the wider, more wealthier areas. So thanks for pointing that out. So you beat out the incumbent in last year's Democratic primary, and you were running on a platform that included a Green New Deal for Philly schools. So, and you mentioned this a little bit, but how do you see education connected to environmental issues?
I just think of them as inextricable. Once you start to take that framework, you take the framework of environmental justice to education, it ultimately is sort of difficult to extricate education and learning from physical and mental well-being and the infrastructure that supports that. So, for instance, even though we talk about unsafe lead levels, that's just a phrase that people tend to use, there isn't really an accepted safe level of lead that our kids should be exposed to. So it's just a way that that's an environmental crisis. We talk a lot about the toxicity crisis in our schools. I mean, we obviously we could talk about it much more than we do, but this toxicity crisis is part of a larger environmental and climate crisis. So in the past, because of, even pre-COVID, because of inadequate HVAC systems, schools closed during summer days because those days were deemed so hot that students couldn't safely be in the buildings for learning. Looking forward, Pennsylvania is expected to be on average about 6 degrees warmer by 2050. And so with this average, we'll see, that's just the average. We'll see more extreme high temperatures, less predictable lows, and more extreme weather as a result. So in the Green New Deal schools for legislation that is out federally and the kind of work that we did in advance of that federal legislation, there's talk about schools about being what they call hubs of resiliency. And that's actually already the case in Philadelphia. Over the course of the pandemic, even when schools were closed for classes, cafeteria employees, student climate staff, and early childhood food service workers were in the buildings every day, ensuring that families who relied on the supplemental meals for their children at schools could still have enough to eat and wouldn't have to go hungry. So we need to see funding move to support more of this, including making those schools, green spaces that are open to the entire surrounding community. Moreover, those workers who did that work are impacted by the conditions of our schools. And, mentioning the cafeteria employees, food service workers, and student climate staff, I just want to lift up that there's so many people who are directly impacted by the physical state of the school buildings. Everyone who's part of the system of care for our children spends their working hours in school buildings. in addition to just the conditions, the internal conditions of our schools, the infrastructure that we know is a problem, there's the impact on the environment around them and our planet. So in Philadelphia, our buildings are just our residential and kind of infrastructure overall are responsible for 79% of our carbon emissions. So it's, the path to a Green New Deal, the path to fighting climate change in a place like Philadelphia is through our buildings. It is through remediating our infrastructure. School buildings aren't wholly responsible, of course, for those emissions, but they are certainly part of it. And we have some of the oldest school infrastructure in the state and in the country. So we haven't had updates to them in years. So for present and future generations, these emissions need to be considered as much as other aspects of the overall infrastructure package. And that's how I think about a Green New Deal for schools.
Yeah, and I guess so for all of that work, we're going to need a lot of resources to take care of it. Last month, Governor Tom Wolf signed the state budget, which he notes has the largest education funding increase in history. Can you outline what this budget does and what it means for Philly schools?
So, it's important to put this budget in context. I mean, we had high expectations. There was, I would actually say, a relatively large sense of unanimity, across the, certainly the Democratic side of the political spectrum, that we would really make meaningful improvements in our school funding. So in February, Tom Wolf proposed $1 billion in basic education funding, all to be moved through the fair funding formula. And the fair funding formula is basically, it was created in order to ensure that students with special needs, students learning English, students experiencing poverty, they needed additional resources to ensure that they had every opportunity afforded to them to reach their full potential. And Pennsylvania is one of the most unequal in terms of school funding in the entire country. And so the way that our funding works, students with the highest needs often get the least resources from the state. And the needs of our communities just aren't met. The version of the budget that was agreed upon, largely put forward by Republicans, is just a fraction of the proposal. The $300 million in addition that was allocated for education, $200 million in basic education funding, $100 million in level up funding, which goes to the 100 poorest school districts, all of which is, certainly salutary. It's not bad, those things, those are good. But when they're adjusted, when you adjust for inflation, the costs that have changed since 2019, that actually leaves us exactly where we were 2 years ago. So even though this is the largest increase in absolute terms, in relative terms, we're back where we were a couple years ago. And in addition, and actually much more insidiously, this year's budget provided for a $40 million expansion in voucher funding via the Educational Improvement Tax Credit Program. This is actually one of the single largest increases to school vouchers, and it essentially acts as an investment in wealthy private schools. In terms of infrastructure, which we were talking about earlier, this budget extended the moratorium on the program known as PlanCon, which is a school construction program through the 21-22 fiscal year. This is the program by which school districts could be reimbursed for new school building construction or reconstruction project applications. This is infrastructure work that's badly needed, not just by the school district of Philadelphia, but by so many districts across the Commonwealth. Ultimately, this budget maintains the status quo for education in Pennsylvania, and this status quo just perpetuates inequity and injustice every single day in schools all across the Commonwealth, and it is totally unacceptable.
Yeah, I know that a few other Democrats, although they celebrated, they are also disappointed. What is missing to fully fund our schools and really have a people's budget for the state?
I think there are three parts to this I would name. So we need luxurious, not just fully funded, but luxuriously funded schools. But just starting, we should have all education funding funneled through the fair funding formula so that it starts to meet the needs, equitably of individual districts. Right now, only new education funding goes to that formula, leaving just these historic inequities in how schools are funded. I know that, under the existing measure, the Philadelphia school district, still needs over $3 billion in additional funding just to start to get to where it should be relative to like some of the wealthier districts. We obviously need infrastructure spending. We need to be we cannot send our students to toxic buildings, to schools one more day. I mean, I can't imagine. I have children that are going to be going to Philadelphia public schools. There are thousands of students who go every day to schools that are not safe, that are not healthy, and that are not resilient. And that brings me to my third point, which is that we need deep energy retrofits for all school buildings to electrify all of their systems, to decrease the impact on climate change and reduce emissions. We need to weatherize them for increased temperature, humidity, and rainfall, which even if we fight climate change and mitigate its effects, is still on track to happen. And we need to build for long-term resiliency so that these schools are hubs, are anchors for their community, that people can go to them during extreme weather events, that they can act as community resources. So, it's funding, it's remediation, and it's retrofitting. I feel like those are all the key elements to start to make schools to make the schools that we really deserve.
And I know you've made the demand to free the funds, like on the Capitol steps in Harrisburg. You've done it here at City Hall in Philadelphia. Can you explain to the audience watching this what the funds you're referring to are and how they could benefit Philly schools and schools throughout the state?
Absolutely. So, these are the funds I'm referring to are the funds that were passed by this year by the Biden administration and Congress, the American Rescue Plan dollars, or just for short, ARP dollars, which were given to Pennsylvania and other states, $7 billion for the explicit purpose of helping to stabilize individuals, families, and communities after, some 18 months and ongoing of hardship due to COVID-19. So these are funds that they don't belong to anyone besides us. These are our funds. These are actually taxpayer dollars, and they belong to us, and they are explicitly devoted for the purpose of recovery.
And I know that the Republicans have been saying we don't have enough, or they're putting this off. Why do you think are they saying they're withholding these funds? And what do you think is the actual story?
So, to be honest, the explicit justification has been these are funds that are being held for a rainy day. There's actually surplus dollars budget dollars that have been moved into the state's rainy day fund. But we're 18 months into a pandemic that has thrust people into unemployment, housing insecurities. We know the eviction moratorium has expired, and thousands of people, millions, may be subject to homelessness, certainly to housing insecurity, food insecurity. We've had millions of people who have had food, been at risk of hunger. The question really, it all just raises the question, like, what is that future rainy day? The rainy day really is now. I mean, we are experiencing this now, and we can be using these funds. For example, the ARP dollars, we've proposed that they can be used for affordable housing. They can be used for housing remediation, for weatherization, for basic repairs, for things that will help people stay in their homes. We know that we can be using these funds for school construction. We can be using these funds for childcare. These are all explicit guidelines within the use of these funds. I just want to say that the Republicans have been withholding these funds because they think it's fiscally responsible. But this is totally disingenuous. There is, in the current budget, funding for all kinds of things. I already mentioned wealthy private schools. There are tax breaks for petrochemical plants. And there is a tax break, I kid you not, for helicopter simulation programs. I don't know about you, Sergio, but I don't recall us talking for the last 18 months about how helicopter simulation programs are really suffering due to COVID-19. I don't think that this was like a major need of our moment, but they passed a break for it. There are credits for that. So I just want to say that they're giving away money to things that we clearly aren't necessarily in need, and they're failing to spend money on things that are explicitly for people in need, and we know that the need is there.
Yeah, I don't know what this rainy day is, if it's not like the pandemic that we've been living through and the Delta variant is like rising. Like, what is this future rainy day? But I'm really glad that you've been doing a lot of political education. I know that I've seen you do the Instagram lives with Councilmember Gim here in Philly. You have a workshop coming up with We the People for like an in-depth look into the state budgets. Why do you think that it's important for everyday working Philadelphians to be following this and to know a little bit more about the budget process?
So, I mean, I just feel like one thing that I experienced this is my first budget process, and the overwhelming sense that I got was that it is a process around which legislators, overwhelmingly, Republican legislators, they want to keep things in the dark. They prefer the lack of pressure. They prefer the fact that, that nobody really knows what's going on with the budget until some details come out, frankly, just a day before we all vote on it. I don't know that, there's like little, snippets of information that come out. That's partly because there isn't enough organized pressure. And so we need people to stay involved. We need people to be putting pressure on the legislature to free our funds. We need that money belongs to us. We're going to be having, the event that you mentioned that I'm hosting with Rep. Rick Krajewski and the group We the People to talk about this, talk about what happened in Harrisburg around the budget on Thursday, August 5th, how the money can be used. That's essential. I encourage people to come out to that. It's a special in-person workshop. We'll be providing dinner and childcare. We'll have real-time translation into Spanish. It's free and open to all. It's at the offices of SEIU 32BJ, 455 North 5th Street. So that's one opportunity to do that. And, another is that we're trying to create access to rental assistance funds for all renters who need it. Philadelphia has tens of millions of dollars left to distribute to renters for utility payments and rent. Again, I mentioned the eviction moratorium expired. This money is again ours, and people should have access to it. You can call my office at 215-952-3119 or email us at Saval, SAVAL, at pasenate.com. All of the work that we do to put pressure on Harrisburg and also to give us license as a social movement oriented office to know that we show that we have backing, that the people are behind us. That's important. Study after study shows that the majority of Pennsylvanians want clean air and water. They want home repair and weatherization programs, and they want fully funded schools and facilities that are nurturing places where children can thrive. And the majority party that holds power doesn't feel accountable to what people that they want. So every person calling the representatives, showing up at their offices, showing up at events and demanding that they free the funds, all of this is important. People organizing together to to amplify the reach of those voices is hugely important too. We will not get the budget that we want unless we organize.
Yeah, and basically you got the calls to action. I was going to say, what's next? Like, this budget has been signed. Like, what hope do we have? What do you think viewers at home should be doing to stay involved and to put pressure?
They should write everyone across the state. They should be making their voice heard to every legislator. Obviously, I want to make clear that it helps if you feel like there's something that we're not doing. We obviously want to know that. If you feel like there's something we're doing well, it helps us to know to get us to push more. It sometimes is helpful to hear people see that people are behind you, right? And to feel that there's a movement behind you, because that's the only way that things get done. So if we can ensure that people are reaching out to their elected officials, to elected officials, frankly, across the state. I know that it may seem like you should be just focused on your district and who you represent, but everyone legislates for all of Pennsylvania. Everything that you do affects people across the state. So if you feel like the majority leader of the Republican Party or the president pro tempore is not representing you, that matters. You you may not be their constituent now, but maybe you move into their district in the future. Maybe your child goes to school at a PASHE system school across the state, or to Penn State, or to the University of Pittsburgh. I mean, there's just ways that we're all bound up in our state's fate together. So all of this matters, and we need to start. And I think, frankly, we're thinking through this together. Can we, at the budget event that we're going to host with Rep. Kajewski, we're going to try to think through organizing strategies that we can use to pressure our elected officials to spend the money that deservedly is ours, and so that next year we really have at least the beginnings or true movement towards the people's budget that we know a majority of people want.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. Like, it sometimes things look bleak, but we know that big things only happen with sustained political pressure from people on the outside. So, like, whether you're doing a good job or a bad job, we need to be letting you hear about it, and we need to reach out to Republicans and legislators all across the state to hear our point of view. But thank you so much for joining us and like walking us through this process. Like, I know for me, like, budget conversations can seem a little wonky, so it's really helpful to have somebody going through this with us. Thank you so much for joining us and PhillyCam.
Thank you, Sergio, and I encourage everyone watching this to stay in touch. And if there's anything that it's all of this is opaque, and it's opaque by design, and to the extent that we can be a window and of course much more into what's going on, and a voice to, we're here for that. And so please stay in touch with our office. Again, you can reach out to us at 215-952-3119 and by email at saval@pasenate.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
All right. Thank you. You too, Sergio.
All right. Thank you so much again. And I hope everyone has a great day. And if you're interested to know more about Reclaim, you can definitely follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. It is @Reclaim Philadelphia.
Thanks, everyone.